In this lecture, I'd like to provide you with an overview of the connections between economics and food, particularly with connections to the future of food and food security, with particular attention in the United States. To begin, I'd like to give a general overview of economic anthropology, which will include a discussion of subsistence strategies. From there, I'll go into a discussion of the agroecological impacts of industrial agriculture. I'll examine agricultural policy and food security. I'll consider Alaska and the current food production paradigm. I'll look a little bit into what is meant by alternative food movements in relation to what is now known as conventional agriculture. And at the end, I'll talk a little bit about the value of agro biodiversity from an ecological standpoint, and look at the role of anthropology in examining some of these issues surrounding food security and food policy in agricultural and subsistence production strategies. If we think about economics in general, we can think about this as a way of making a living, acquiring products that are satisfying and at the smallest cost. In other words, maximizing utility for individuals. Along these lines, we have the notion of scarcity, that people will never have enough resources in order to fulfill the desires that they have. And so this is constantly driving individuals to try to accumulate more in competition with one another for these scarce resources which are available. Traditionally, economists divide economic activity into three categories of production, distribution, exchange, as well as consumption. In anthropology, of course, we look at this holistically, and we look at the intersections between production, distribution, exchange, as well as consumption. We, in particular, look at how economics relates to human nature as a whole and reflects on the daily decisions that people make in their everyday lives and the way that they go about making a living as a whole. This figure here comes from Levenda and Schultz's Anthropology, What Does It Mean to Be Human? But we can see here that there are basically, as they describe it, two main subsistence strategies, that of food collectors and food producers. We'll be focusing, for the most part, on mechanized industrial agriculture and some of the alternatives to mechanized industrial agriculture in this particular discussion. In terms of food collectors, though, we have small-scale foragers who typically live in harsher climates. Sparser resources are available, and so this necessitates a greater movement of individuals over space as well as time. Resources might only be available seasonally. They might be relatively sparse, and then the population would have to move to a new area. This is in contrast to complex foragers who are able to settle more in one area potentially because of the rich environmental resources that are present. They don't need necessarily to keep moving from area to area. The Tlingit are a really good example of this. Historically, in the Tufian society is too. If we go back to our earlier discussions of substantivists and formalists, the original affluent societies are in fact foraging peoples representing the original affluent society. Again, this is Marshall Solonson's work from earlier. Other food production strategies include pastoralists who are involved in herding animals. Many times this involves nomadic pastoralism or movement of following the animals or moving the animals seasonally where resources aren't available for the animals to eat. And then there's the notion of extensive agriculture as well as intensive agriculture. And certainly we saw some of this in last week's discussion of land as capital. In extensive agriculture, you have, this is essentially slash and burn or swidden agriculture. These swidden agricultural systems are essentially set up to basically bring out the nutrients which are available in the soil by burning and then growing the crops for a number of years and then moving on to a new area. This is well shown in Guri and Moran's piece, who was interested in commercial agriculture amongst the Yucatec Maya from the state of Yucatan. One of the readings for this particular week. In terms of intensive agriculture, you have the use of plows, irrigation coming in, draft animals, fertilizers. Again, this goes to the notions of land as capital, building the soil, building the water resources available, creating more arable land in the sense of terracing and the like. Finally, we have mechanized industrial agriculture, or this is also known as farming or animal husbandry, which is modeled as an industry for large-scale food production. And Sidney Mintz does a good job of talking about this in his book, Sweetness and Power. Again, we saw this in many of the articles for last week, looking at sugar production, silver production, and the impacts of timber on world systems and environmental history. Some of the considerations with mechanical industrial agriculture is necessitates a continual use of new technologies. This is what's become known as the technology treadmill. It's also very energy intensive. We see a lot of petrochemicals being used in terms of growing these crops for the manufacture and distribution of things like fertilizers, herbicides, pesticides, and whatnot. It also necessitates it requires a massive distribution system. The average, of course, depending on the literature that you read, is anywhere between 1,000 and 1,500 miles in travel. And in the U.S., of course, we grew up as a agrarian nation. Of course, we made the transition. So seeing a decrease in the total number of farmers as a whole. And of course, we see this playing out on the vast landscape today in terms of monocultures, and these are incredibly vulnerable to pests and diseases. You have the same sort of crop in the same area, sometimes planted multiple times in 1 year, which can lead to all sorts of crop failures, which I'll address a little bit later on. We also see consolidation of seed and pharmaceutical companies, and you can see from this diagram here the consolidation that's taking place in terms of mergers and acquisitions with Monsanto, Bayer, DuPont, Synergita, representing some of these larger pharmaceutical companies that, of course, have gone into the realm of buying seed companies. And of course, there's an intersection here in terms of being able to produce agricultural herbicides. Probably the most well-known for this is Monsanto for their production of glyphosate or Roundup that is utilized fairly extensively throughout the Midwest, and also quite a bit by homeowners who don't want to deal with picking grass out of cracks in the concrete or whatnot. We also see consolidation of food products as a whole, and you can see from this many of these brands that you recognize that in one sense you might think of as a unique standalone brand, when in fact they are owned by larger companies. So Coca-Cola and PepsiCo's, Taco Bell and Pizza Hut and KFC. Mars, probably most notably buying Seeds of Change, which is a small seed company in New Mexico region who did a lot of work with conserving biodiversity. And now, since the acquisition by Mars, I bought them, they've been, this has become a recognized brand and it's really expanded out quite a bit. I had the opportunity to talk with one time one of the individuals who was really involved in starting Seeds of Change, and he suggested that the buying by Mars allowed for just more good to happen. It allowed for greater distribution of resources as a whole. As a whole in the United States, too, we have to think about the role of politics in shaping economics in the future of food, and we see this with conversations and speeches by presidents and former presidents, and here's a quote from former President George W. Bush, tying in the idea of food security with national security. Of course, the United States for a long time has imagined itself as the breadbasket of the world. Here you have Nixon with Earl Watts, longtime Secretary of Agriculture, who's probably infamous for, well, very well known for his quote on planting fence row to fence row, and getting big or getting out in terms of agricultural production today. So setting the United States up as the breadbasket of the world, also with great power comes great responsibility. And we can see this in a reflection of George W. Bush. Here you can see him down on the ranch doing some work, but looking at the idea that we are in fact compassionate and extending our compassion out through this massive production of food in the Midwest to other regions of the world as a whole. So a lot of discussion has been made about what it's going to take in order to feed the future, and there's been a lot of different discussions on whether further industrialization is needed, so-called green or growing buildings, very superficial environments, hydroponics. Bandar Shiva is a well-noted author. We see some popular films coming out, King Corn and Food Inc. In terms of what the coming food crisis and what to do. And the idea here is, of course, that population will always and never be continually expanding, and how do we feed the new population that's coming online, becoming alive. Now, and this goes to the idea too that we see today a shortfall of 1 billion people globally, over 1 billion being food insecure as a whole. Particularly in Alaska, and I'll address this more in some of my other talks. In terms of production, we have a heavy reliance on subsistence in rural areas in particular. Alaska agriculture, like many regions, supplies less than 5% of the food that Alaska consumes, and so there's a real heavy reliance on processed foods. Now, of course, in terms of processed foods, for those of you from Alaska, you are well familiar with this idea that the high cost of processed foods in Alaska, and the idea of the shipment that has to come in terms of distribution and exchange. Still today, we see traditional practices of sharing becoming incredibly important. In terms of Fairbanks itself, we have food insecurity reported. 12% of respondents indicated that this is a survey that was done within Fairbanks. 12% reported some food insecurity, and 5% reported severe food security, particularly looking at subsistence issues and issues of subsistence versus non-subsistence goods. We talk about nutrition at all as a whole, what is actually meant by good food. Of course, with Alaska Native traditional foods today, we see things like methylmercury, mercury contamination in general, contamination by heavy metals, and indeed some talk of radiation from the recent disaster at Fukushima. In Fairbanks itself, and in Alaska as a whole, we can see, particularly in rural areas, very high cost of living, high cost of food in relation to Fairbanks as a whole. A lot of this helped to drive some of the migration, potentially, into Fairbanks and other urban areas in the heat-to-eat crisis of 2008. So what are some of the alternatives overall? We'll talk about some of these during this week. The organic food movement, community-supported agriculture, community-shared agriculture, permaculture, community gardens, and local and regional food movements as a whole. Alternative food movements also include traditional food revitalization movements against Native American peoples. My dissertation work on the Tonopah Nation documents some of the traditional food revitalization work that was being done in the area and still continuing today at a regional level. In terms of what biodiversity does, in terms of species diversity, there's an incredible reliance on a very small number of species for overall food supply today, with nearly 2/3 of that coming from corn, wheat, rice, and wheat. Two, in terms of genetics, we see vulnerabilities that occur without diversity. Recent examples of citrus in Florida, where 18 million trees were destroyed. Corn in the U.S. South, and of course the great hunger of great potato famine in Ireland. The value of genetic diversity, we see the incredible value that's given by biodiversity in terms of doubling of yields, increasing the value of crop as a whole. Agro biodiversity also can act, so-called feed the soil. Soils are essentially acting as a bank. And again, some ecological services overall. So as anthropologists, we can think about some of these concepts here, looking at the relationship between local and global and contemporary food systems, property ownership regimes in terms of real property as well as intellectual property, how race, ethnicity, and class intersect with this, and particularly Julie Guthman's work and how anthropologists can contribute to understanding of contemporary